Thank you so much for being here today with us in our webinar. Um, so we are very, very happy to host Lucas Ronconi and Malik Diallo. They're going to talk for about 35, 40 minutes. They organized a very interesting presentation. And after that, we're going to give the space for some questions. But there's any clarifying question that you really need to know about, feel free to raise your hand and we'll try to accommodate it during the presentation. But we would prefer the questions at the end. This webinar also will be recorded. So for those who cannot make it today in person, it will become available in the ILO website. So my name is Fabiola Mieres. I am a researcher in the ILO research department, working on labor compliance in the ILO research project. And today we're going to discuss a very interesting paper that we'll share with you afterwards. There has been an increasing appreciation of the centrality of enforcement to the edifice of labor protection. However, promoting and upholding compliance with labor law continues to be a colossal challenge. Structural changes in the global economy that have impacted labor markets have broken down businesses into smaller units, lines of responsibility have been distorted, and in some contexts, union power has dwindled. Limited resources has been identified as a long-standing problem for those charged with enforcing the labor law, and delivering deterrence has been another persistent problem. In many developed economies, however, there has been a concerted effort to tackle labor violations in novel ways, and the academic literature has focused mostly on these aspects. But today, we're going to learn from an interesting study that sheds light on a different context and a different jurisdiction, showing us that there are opportunities for experimentation and learning. Lucas Ronconi and Malik Diallo have collected new objective measures of private and public labor enforcement and show us how the letter of the code does not necessarily translate into a good proxy for effective regulation in the context of Senegal. Thank you again to both for being here today. And Lucas is professor of economics at the University of Buenos Aires and researcher at CONICET in Argentina. He's also a non-residential research fellow at ESA in Germany and the PEP in Kenya. His research focuses on labor market institutions in developing countries, and he has published extensively on labor informality and enforcement. He previously worked at the Institute for Research on Labor and Employment at UC Berkeley in the US. Tierno Malik Diallo is a lecturer at Gaston Berger University and a non-resident research fellow um, at Partnership for Economic Policy. His research centers around labor economics, gender poverty, and rural economics. He has been involved in research collaborations with the Partnership for Economic Policy, the International Fund for Agricultural Development, IFAD, and the African Economic Research Consortium, AERC. So thank you again to both of you for being here today. Without further ado, the floor is all yours. Thanks.
Thank you very much for your words, Fabiola. Thank you so much. Allow me to give you a bit of the background about this paper. Malik and I, we are both labor economists, and we were talking about what is the ideal way to regulate the labor market in our countries. And as labor economists, we immediately have to have this struggle about what are the effects of EPL, of employment protective legislation. And here there are competing narratives with ambiguous results. On the one hand, if you believe that there is perfect competition in the labor market, you will tend to believe that EPL might bring many distortions, while if you tend to believe that there is a more employer power, what we usually call monopsony in the labor market, introducing EPL will be welfare enhancing. So we immediately, our background is that we immediately want to do empirical work. And when you want to do empirical work, the existing evidence is mixed, but it was one characteristic in common. Most of the evidence usually only looks at variation in the letter of the law, in the jure, in the letter of the books. So they are comparing a country that has a labor code with a large number of protections, and then compare labor market outcomes in that country with a country where has a more flexible labor code. But in our countries, well, we look into the letter of the law is important, but it's only part of the story. There is the laws are not always enforced. So what conceptually matters is effective labor regulation, which is the combination of the letter of the law and enforcement efforts. So when you want to have some measures of enforcement efforts, there is a huge lack of data. So what Malik and I did was to go out and try to have some idea about what is exactly going on in terms of enforcement. And ideally, at the very beginning, initially we wanted to cover all Francophone West Africa. We end up collecting some measures for every Francophone West African countries, but for other measures, we were only able to collect data from Senegal. So, and simply just to keep in mind, to say something that is obvious, but in most West African countries, basically 9 out of 10 of workers do not receive a number of, are informally employed. So this issue, which being informally employed, there are some self-employees that are not receiving any type of protections because those protections are not legally mandated in that sector. But then there is a huge share of workers who are employees who are not receiving legally mandated benefits. So studying enforcement is kind of obvious in a society where lack of compliance with the law is so high. So let me, what I'm going to do next is going to provide some quantitative measures of enforcement for countries in the region, and then Malik will go ahead with with the qualitative measures, which I think that a combination of both qualitative and quantitative data, given the lack of available metrics, is the right way to go. So I think that a combination of both is what provides a good picture of what's going on in terms of enforcement in the region. So let me go ahead. There are some institutional aspects about how enforcement is organized. Let me say very briefly that most of these countries are former British colonies, and in that sense, there is usually a general, as in France, there is usually a general labor inspectorate that is in charge, that has the responsibility to enforce all types of labor regulations. So if you want me to get into the detail, into more details, I can focus there later. Excuse me, just 1 second. There are a number of agencies distributed within the region, but it's mostly centralized, and I guess that Malik definitely knows more than me about this, so he will be able to cover those issues. So let me go back to the methodology and let me, excuse me, my apologies. Let me, when you think about enforcement efforts, there are a number of things, there are a number of things that you want to know. On the one hand, you want to know how many inspectors are working and whether they are effective at doing their job or not. And you also want to know, so you want to know not only how many labor inspectors, but you might want to know how many firms are being inspected. And you might want to know whether those inspectors are imposing fines or not, whether they are going to the right places, whether they are going to those firms that are more likely to violate labor laws or not. You also want to know. You also want to collect some measures that are more likely to be part of what is usually called private enforcement. You want to know whether workers are aware of their rights or not. If workers are not aware of their rights, they don't have they won't be able to defend themselves. You also want to know whether access to the judiciary is really accessible to workers and so on. So when conceptually thinking about how to measure this concept of enforcement, it immediately comes to your mind that it requires to look into a number of different aspects, and some of those aspects are available, are easier to quantify with secondary sources, and some we are requiring collecting our own data. So I will first present the data that we gather together from other sources, and then Malik will present the work that we did to collect our own data. So here in this table, we have all the countries that are part of Francophone West Africa. The first column is actually simply looking at the letter of the law about how stringent is the labor code in each of these countries. So this is based on a ranking, and what I'm trying to reflect on this, what we are trying to reflect on this first column, is what is a usual argument among many labor economists, which is labor codes in Francophone West Africa are particularly stringent, are usually quite protective. You see, when countries are, country number one is the country with the least protective law, the US. Country rank number 180 is a country with the most protective labor code. So when you see that Senegal, Niger are ranking 165, 166, it means that they are among the countries with the most protective labor laws. The second, third, and all the other columns are data that we collected, and data that we collected from a large number of sources. The most important one are official information provided by the government. So we have information about the number of labor inspectors working in each of these countries, the number of inspectors per worker, and the number of inspections they conduct per worker, and those measures some idea of how that has evolved over time. So the very first thing I want to say is that the number of labor inspectors in the region is on average about 2 per 100,000 workers. That is quite lower than the average for the world, which is a bit higher than 8. So 2 instead of 8. Now, when you look to the number of, so West African countries have fewer labor inspectors per worker compared with other regions in the world. Now, when you look to the number of inspections, the number of workplaces they visit per year, you find that in the region, they tend to visit about 10 places per year per 100,000 workers, while the world average is almost 800. So the one measure of the productivity of labor inspectors in this aspect is striking how low it is in the region. We also collected some measures about financial fines, and the information about fines is only according to the letter of the law and or only for the case of lack of compliance with the minimum wage. So here what we have is what is the financial fine an employer will get if it pays below the minimum wage in these countries. Whether this is effectively enforced or not, there is very little data about this. And in general, financial fines are quite low. These are in dollars, purchasing power parity, are quite low, at least compared with other countries. Now, this kind of information, when you look to the evolution over time, you observe a little bit of an increase in the number of inspectors and a much larger increase in their productivity, at least measured as the number of inspections they conduct, this is good news, but it is really far from what we observe in other places. So our very first reaction from collecting these two measures are, first, those who argue that that the state is heavily involved in the regulation of labor market in West African countries are only telling part of the story. The state is heavily involved in the sense that it wrote a labor code that is highly protective, but the same state is not putting any or very few resources to enforce that law. So it is so that on the one hand. On the other hand, those who tend to argue, oh, the problem of enforcement in this region is lack of resources. Well, when you look to this, and that surely plays a role, no question about that. But when you look to the productivity of labor inspectors, you start realizing perhaps they don't have the right incentives. Something is going on that even with the few available resources, perhaps much can be done. So now, having said that, many other issues, we immediately realize, Malik and I, we immediately realize that while this type of quantitative evidence is objective, is useful, it's only partially informative. There are a few things that are very relevant, and these quantitative measures are not able to inform us. And so let me say that before passing the mic to Malik. So one key concern is whether workers are aware of their rights and whether they have access to the judiciary. Because if the public inspection agency is poorly funded, is not doing a good work, but the judiciary is functioning perfectly and workers are very aware of their rights, well, private enforcement would be great. So you don't need much public enforcement. So we want to know whether, of course, our anecdotal evidence is that private enforcement is far from doing very well. But anyway, we wanted to document that. Second, we want to know about those few inspectors and those particularly few inspections are going to the right places, are going to those places where the health of workers is at risk, where there are big violations of workers' rights or not. And this quantitative data is not able to say much about that. So let me pass the mic to Malik, and so thank you very much. Malik, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Lucas. Can you move to the next slide, please? Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here today to talk about labor enforcement in Senegal. Before sharing the main findings of our interviews, allow me to briefly highlight the socio-demographics of our key informants. As you can see here in the table, we interviewed both informal employees and employers, as well as labor inspectors. And the age of the informal employees who participated in the interviews ranged from 23 to 57 years. And among the 21 informal employees interviewed in the first group, 11 had some tertiary education, 4 had secondary education, and 6 had primary education level. And among those interviewed in the second group, 18 had primary education and 2 had no formal education. We can also see in the table that all the informal employers who participated in our interviews owned small businesses, and they all reported paying salaries above the minimum wage, but none of them give paid vacations or social security benefits to their workers. And we can also see from the table that all the labor inspectors we interviewed, including the labor controllers, have master's degrees, and they all have passed the competitive exam of the School of Administration. And in the opinion of the labor inspectors, the labor inspectorate is very strict in its selection process, and it is impossible to enter the School of Administration through political connections. Next one, please. As you may know, in Senegal, 97% of businesses operate in the informal sector, and 9 out of 10 workers are engaged in informal employment as well. And the size of this informal sector is a big challenge in the country, as it means that the overwhelming majority of workers are employed in poor conditions with little or no access to social benefits. Having said that, what we noticed in our study is that labor inspections target mainly formal businesses. Let me explain a bit. Firstly, none of the workers we interviewed have ever been approached and interviewed by a labor inspector, and only 2 worked in a firm that has been once inspected. Secondly, the employees we interviewed in the first group were requested to indicate their level of agreement with the statement regarding the conduct of labor inspections in the informal sector. And what we found is over 80% of the employees agreed that labor inspectors almost never visit informal businesses. And for the employees we interviewed in the second group, most of them, 90%, did not even know about the existence of labor inspectors. And the difficulty of reaching the informal sector is also reflected in the annual official reports. For example, in 2021, the Labor Inspectorate recorded a 35% rate of non-compliance with health insurance and a 27% rate of compliance with social security registration. However, both figures are significantly smaller than the actual rates of non-compliance, which are estimated at least at 84%. Another piece of evidence that indicates that labor inspection mainly takes place in the formal sector is that many firms prefer to operate informally in the hope of avoiding inspection and also paying taxes, as pointed out by one of the labor inspectors we spoke to. This situation also indicates that there is a certain lack of incentives for formalization. that keeps businesses from operating in the formal sector. And a reason why businesses prefer sometimes to operate informally is that many formal businesses are subject to tax harassments according to some studies conducted in Senegal. And as a number of tax liable businesses is very limited in the country, once a firm is identified as paying taxes, it is often subjected to repeated audits and inspection. Next one, please. So in our study, we also try to examine the extent to which informal workers are aware of their labor rights. And what we found is most informal workers don't know their labor rights. For example, regarding the minimum wage, almost half of the informal workers we spoke to reported knowing what the minimum wage is, but only 2 of them were able to indicate the amount of the monthly wage in Senegal. To further investigate the level of awareness of their labor rights, the informal workers we spoke to were also requested to indicate their level of agreement with 2 false statements as highlighted in this table. And the findings reported in the table indicate that 60% of the informal workers agreed or strongly agreed that employers do not have the obligation to register informal workers. And also 56% also agreed that employers do not have the obligation to give paid vacations to informal employees. We can see that many informal employees lack awareness of their labor rights, leaving more room for non-compliance when dealing with some employers. The graph we have here highlights a positive correlation between workers' education and awareness of their rights. And not surprisingly, the more educated workers are, the better they know their rights. For example, among employees with primary education or less, only 15% knew that informal workers must be registered, and only 23 know that they are entitled to paid vacations. But among informal workers with some tertiary education, over 80% of them confirm that employers must register informal workers and give them paid vacations. Next one, please, Lucas. So, as found in other countries, we noticed also in our study that in Senegal, the lack of awareness of labor rights is exacerbated by the reluctance of informal workers to complain because of fear of losing their jobs. For example, when asking informal workers, did you ever denounce your employer for lack of compliance with labor law? We got responses such as, "I am afraid of the consequences. If I do, there is a risk of being dismissed, etc." When a labor conflict arises between a worker and an employer in Senegal, the labor inspector is called upon to mediate. And the conflict may only be referred to the court system for arbitration if it cannot be settled through mediation. However, the fear of reprisals from employers often keeps workers from taking legal action. And because of this, among the 41 informal workers we spoke to, only 3 denounced their employers for non-compliance with labor laws. And what is worth mentioning here is that these workers are highly educated and know very well their labor rights. Next one, please. So as we conclude, our findings indicate that Francophone West African countries, including Senegal, usually have the most protective labor costs, but at the same time, a very low level of enforcement. We found in our paper that most informal workers are not aware of their rights, and very few of them denounce their employers due to fear of losing their jobs and not finding something else. And private enforcement, I mean, employees going to the judiciary is unlikely to work effectively when workers do not know their rights or are afraid of denouncing their employers. Based on our findings, we think that there is a great need to protect these informal workers. And one way to do it is to give them political voice and power. Thank you very much for your attention. Back to you, Lucas and Fabiola.
Thank you very much, Lucas and Tierno, for sharing the findings of this innovative research, which to share with the public, it has recently been published, accepted. So we will circulate the paper with everyone who would like to read it and have more details about how it went. This important contribution on of debates that have been more established probably in your previous work, Lucas, in Latin America, or a lot of the literature in English-speaking countries. We know a lot, but we need to unpack a little bit more these issues in other contexts, Africa and Asia being of great interest for the ILO. So as questions come, is anyone want to raise their hand? One of the key issues that emerges from this work and is important for the ILO is, as you know, what different roles, one of the questions that came to me is whether we should give the state the monopoly over enforcement. So what does this mean for the other actors of the world of work when it comes to what roles they can play? I'm thinking here of, for instance, trade unions or other civil society organizations. What has been the role in providing education or training, litigation, or even using these mechanisms in these countries? And also, what are the types of recommendations from this research you can give to all sorts, different types of employers, taking into account different sizes of companies and small companies, but also different agencies, not just the ministries of labor or those tasks with this. How is interagency cooperation, which is another area that is emerging as an important area for enforcement in your work?
Thank you, Fabiola. Should I wait, or should we wait for more questions to come, or would you prefer us to go ahead and start discussing these issues?
Yes, you can start discussing some of these issues as we collect more questions. Thank you.
Malik, do you allow me to start talking? I am the oldest, so please give me please give me that right. No, so no, this is extremely interesting. Allow me to give you my view, Fabiola, on the work I have been doing in the developing world in general, about this idea about trying to work towards having a welfare enhancing type of regulation, the ideal type of labor regulation. Can we as a society find the most adequate type of regulations to improve the welfare of members of society? How should we do that? And the reason I end up working on these issues is that I feel we are too far apart from that, too far apart. So we have this, what we are describing for West Africa regrettably happens in many other countries too. This combination of having, on the one hand, a very nice, at least very nice for those who are a bit more progressive, a very nice labor code, but then that labor code that is not enforced. So how to move to a more logical and more effective type of policy to effectively improve the quality of life of workers. And let me add a few comments. I will tend to believe I wouldn't give the monopoly to any single actor. That's usually not a good idea, not even um, uh, so 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 let me first repeat that the idea of private enforcement it clearly is certainly important. Certainly important. We are in a topic where the victim knows the victimizer. So if under certain conditions, private enforcement, no question, private enforcement is useful, and under certain conditions, private enforcement can be enough. In the developing world, private enforcement cannot be enough. It is certainly useful, no question, but it cannot be enough. On the one hand, because workers are little aware, because of the fear of retaliation, because of access to the judiciary. So for those who negatively, many of our colleagues, at least in labor economics, mostly in the neoclassical tradition, negatively react to a presentation that talks about public enforcement because they immediately think about command and control. Well, the private market, private enforcement is not going to work well. It's not going to work well under these other structural conditions. And regrettably, in the field of labor economics, there's a lot of discussion about how stringent are labor codes, but almost nobody is studying how little enforcement is conducted, how little workers are aware about their rights. So that is, for me, a kind of a biased research agenda. Having said that, let me to provide another broad perspective, there are a number of colleagues, mostly in developed countries, that have been talking about co-enforcement, which is, I guess that for certain countries, probably for the US, might make a lot of sense. The idea is that certain like labor unions should work with the government, or even some NGOs might help improving public enforcement. The issue with having co-enforcement in the developing world, well, one initial challenge is that labor union density is quite low. So if you go to a country like Senegal or any other country in West Africa, labor union density is very, very slow, very, very low. So, but even, I guess that even more important than that, labor union density only exists among highly skilled workers, or almost only so which are already, I mean, labor regulation at the very end, we philosophically care about labor regulation because we want to help those who are at the very low end of the labor market. We don't want labor regulations only to benefit high-skilled workers. We mostly care about those who are at the very bottom.
Yes.
And
Lucas, these are, excuse me to interrupt, these are very important points, especially because there's a lot of promise on co-enforcement, but when we dig and look deeper into other development contexts, it doesn't seem to be so. So we have more questions about this research per se from colleagues that, if you agree, I would like to pose. Some posted in the chat, but I can also give the floor. So I will read one from Janine, and then I will give the floor to Franz, who asked as well. Janine, also, I don't know if you want to say it yourself or I can read it. So she says, I have a question about your interviews with the labor inspectors. In the paper, it seems to suggest that the Senegalese inspectors were not allowed to impose fines. Is that correct? Also, in these interviews with inspectors, were you able to get a sense from them or what they think needed to be done to improve compliance or even their own enforcement efforts. I also had a question about the fines, so that's good. And then maybe Franz, you want to unmute yourself and pose your question? Thank you.
Yeah, good afternoon, and thanks so much for this, I thought, really informative and yeah, even puzzling presentations that you gave, and of course, very important policy messages that you highlighted about the contradictions here between the levels of protectiveness on the one hand and enforcement on the others. I had a few questions. I think two are on specific details, and then one is at the broader policy level. The first one is just a little about a little detail I was curious about, and that is the difference between labor inspectors and labor controllers. You mentioned that both categories had master degrees and passed a competitive exam, but I was curious to know a bit more about what the difference between these actors are in terms of their status, their functions, and also their competences. The second, more detailed related question concerns your table 1 in your slides. You know, this very interesting table with all sorts of data. And one data point regarding Senegal, I thought made me particularly curious, because there seemed to be, if I saw correctly, a significant jump in the number of inspections in Senegal between 2011 and 2020, while the number of inspectors, according to the table, had actually not increased, but actually even gone down a little bit. Maybe I missed it, but if you could explain a bit how you see, what you see is actually behind this change in terms of the inspections, I'd be very interested. And then at the policy level, I was just curious to know whether, considering these findings that I think they're very powerful, are you aware, for example, in Senegal, of a debate at the domestic level about how to strengthen the reach of the labor inspectorate into the informal economy, or has it been generally accepted that labor inspectors are just not working for the informal sector? I was also curious whether there are some lessons to be learned from other contexts, like labor inspection strategies in Brazil. And as a lawyer, and that's my final point, to what extent do you feel that courts or the judiciary in general plays a role in this debate? We know that, for example, in certain Latin American countries like Colombia, institutions like the Constitutional Court have played an important role in terms of extending the rights of informal workers and also contributing to enforcement in some respects. So I'd be interested in your views on that as well. Thank you very much.
These are extremely interesting questions. There are a number that, Malik, you are certainly much better informed than me to answer. So pick up the ones that you like, please, first, and then I can continue later. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Lucas. Thank you all for your questions. Let me start with the difference between labor inspector and labor controller. In Senegal, both of them are in charge of controlling the application of labor law, and both must pass the competitive exam to enter the school of administration. But the key difference between the two is that a high school diploma is just enough for hiring a labor controller, while for a labor inspector, one must have at least a master's degree. So we can consider that labor controllers are kind of assistant to labor inspectors. But in our paper, we don't make the difference between the two. So we use these two terms interchangeably. There is also another question about the fines. In Senegal, the labor inspectors used to adopt a pedagogical approach the first time they visit a firm, and sanctions are used as a last resort when a compliance notice has been ignored. What is worth mentioning is that there is no fine among the list of sanctions that can be made, and depending on the nature of the violation, the sanction may range from a letter of observation or formal notice to a process verbal of infraction, but there is no fine. And Lucas and I do believe that this is a big barrier to the labor inspection, because we think that if they want employers to deal with labor laws, one needs to impose some fines. Lucas, you can take that and try to answer for this question.
Thanks, Malik. Then let me add a few comments, and then we can go back to you, Malik, with the question that Janine raised about the interview with inspectors. So, Franz, you are totally right about the large increase in the number of firms that the inspector visited in Senegal, but while the number of inspectors didn't change much, actually it went down. So this information is obtained for a combination of two sources. One is administrative data published by the secretary, what is the Secretary of Labor in Senegal, and the other useful piece of information is that the American embassy in many countries, the American ambassador asks in each country to a public official about how many inspectors are in the labor inspectorate and how many firms are inspected per year. So that is the source of the information. What actually happened? I think we tend to believe that it's simply about an improvement. Again, it is still extremely low, right? So it's a tenfold improvement, but starting from an extremely low number. The other, your question about Brazil, that one is extremely interesting. Brazil had a reform to the constitutions in the mid-1990s and basically gave the labor inspectorate autonomy over the political cycle, over the electoral cycle. And so let me spend 1 or 2 minutes just to confess one thing that I learned a lot about Senegal. Coming from Latin America, my very first hypothesis was that a major challenge to improve labor inspection in Latin American countries was the fact that the agencies were controlled by electoral politics. And electoral politics there's absolutely everything is great about electoral politics, but they tend to have short-term horizons. You have to compete in the next election, so you are particularly concerned about destroying informal jobs. So we are going to go, if a politician who's going to compete in the next election is in charge, is in control of the enforcement agency, he's immediately thinking, hey, I don't want to have any job destruction for very good reasons. Now, the point is that by avoiding the short-term cost of labor inspection, we are also missing the benefits, which sometimes take a little bit of a longer term to realize. So now that was, and I tend to believe that particularly for my country and Argentina, there is no question that if we have a Bavarian bureaucracy, I would tend to argue that things will improve. Having said that, in the case of Senegal and many other Francophone West African countries, the agency is truly independent from electoral politics. And however, informal workers have little voice. So there is a kind of an agency problem where labor inspectors, although they are independent from electoral politics, they appear to not react enough to the needs of the large majority of workers who are working without access to labor benefits. So we tend to believe, and this is very speculative, we tend to believe that to understand the political economy of labor regulation, the most important problem is that informal workers have little voice into the policy-making process. If they get more voice, we are pretty sure that labor regulation, either de jure or either the enforcement, will change in the adequate direction.
Mhm. Thank you, Lucas. Being aware of time, there are 3 interesting questions that I would like to put to the floor, and then you can summarize your answers, taking this into light. One comes from our colleague Juan Garcia, and he would like to know whether employers were consulted on their knowledge of the labor standards with which they must comply. Perhaps it would be relevant if small businesses, especially those with family workers, were included in the analysis. That's one. Another question from our colleague Dagmar Walter is that you mentioned inspectors have not visited informal businesses, but in her experience, in many countries, labor laws do not apply to cover many aspects of workers and enterprises in the informal economy. For instance, do labor inspectors have the legal mandate to inspect informal settings in this context? Just wondering. Another comment from our colleague Juan Chacaltana, another big expert on informality, is regarding the conclusions. He's wondering if the unit cost of an inspection is constant or decreasing by firm size. Probably the unit cost is lower for larger firms. Would that have a role in these results? So I think here you have enough material to complement also the other answers to colleagues' questions. And you have 5 minutes.
Okay, so let me jump in first. Regarding the first question, whether we consulted employers on their knowledge of the labor standard which they must comply. As you may know, we interviewed both informal employees and also employers. And during our interviews, what we noticed also was that some employers didn't know some labor standards, and it was quite striking to us. For example, I came across an employer who did not know the amount of minimum wage that they should pay to their workers. And this was not the only employer who did not know this kind of labor standards. So this means that the informal sector is not at all aware of the labor standard they must comply, and also workers don't know their labor rights. So it is something that came across in our findings. And I agree that we do not emphasize these aspects in our paper, but it's something that I came across during the interviews. The second question, whether labor inspection has the legal mandate to inspect the informal sector, I would say because in Senegal they don't make difference between formal and informal sector. During the interviews, what they say is they used to oversee both the informal and the formal sector. They don't make any difference. But deep down, when you ask question, you find out that it's not the case. They mostly focus on the formal sector. while we have a big size of informal sector, and while also labor violation is mostly prevalent in the informal sector. So they have that legal mandate to inspect every firms, whether the firm is in the formal or informal sector in Senegal. Thank you, Lucas, and back to you.
Just to add a minor comment with respect to this last issue, India, South Asia is actually an exception. So India is a country where a number of labor regulations only apply to workers who are working in firms above 10, above 15, above 100, etc. It's actually an exception in the developing world. In most developing countries, labor rights are de jure universal. So, of course, there are sometimes some sector, domestic service, of course, so on and so forth. But usually, if you are an employee, you have the right to pay vacation, regardless of the size of the firm. So, so a lot of confusion because India is different, a lot of confusion. So that sometimes makes a lot of confusion. That's all. I think there was a question by Janine at the very beginning about the inspectors we interview. Sorry if we did not respond that. I miss it.
I think you can do it now. You have 1 minute. I think it was an important question about how they see their work, the problems, and ways to improve compliance. If you can some have reflections on that, and we'll take those as final reflections. And even though knowing that it's 5, if you can stay with us 1 or 2 more minutes, I think it's an important issue. And thank you all the participants and of course yourself for sharing your research.
Malik, please.
No, please go ahead. Go ahead.
In my opinion, what could be going on is that it is easier to inspect a formal business. Things are first of all, most formal business are close to where the agency is located, so you don't have to travel much, and that is important because the public sector usually doesn't give you money to pay for the fuel cost. So if you have to go very far to inspect rural areas, whatever, so that will not be covered. And second, formal business are usually have their by definition, they have their records and they tend to have things more organized. And there is something going on there a bit. I don't want to get into an extreme of a social class Marxist analysis of labor inspection, but there is something about highly educated inspectors for some reason focusing on formal firms where usually more highly educated workers work. But this is extremely speculative, what I'm saying. And actually, the person who conducted the interviews with the labor inspectors, the more formal ones, was Malik. So that's all I have to say.
Thank you. Malik, I don't know if you would like to add something else or...
No, I
No.
think Lucas has covered all. Thank you.
Okay. So, I mean, of course, it's a very complex area that we're trying to unpack further and gather more evidence in our project. And we will continue having some webinars and also on the practical side. Let me quickly advertise our From Theory to Practice webinar next week, which is going to be with someone from the European Labour Agency. So this is more of a practical seminar where we'll discuss some of cross-border inspections in a completely different context. So here jurisdiction and context matters for our political economy analysis. Thank you so much, Lucas and Malik. We continue working together. Thank you so much to all the colleagues in the ILO, but also from outside. who took time of their busy days to be here today with us, and will share the link and the paper. It has also been shared in the chat for those who are interested, and do not hesitate to stay in touch if you have further questions. I wish you all a great day, rest of it, if it's your morning, and afternoon, a lovely evening. Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.